And now a lot of Indians think it's easier for them to make it to MIT and Harvard. Percentage of Asian Americans increased by 5% in America, and percentage of international students increased by 10% as well.
I did interviews in Nigeria, Nicaragua, Pakistan, and Spain. I have an obligation to deny you, and your obligation is to prove to me that you should not be denied.
How do you see the future of merit-based immigration in the next 4 years, depending on who gets elected? Hello everyone, today we have someone who is going to guide us in this election year about immigration, about student visa, about green card. What is the future of immigrants in the US right now? Because Chris from ARGO VISA has influenced politics, influenced governments. So for example, from 2016 to 2020, if you were trying to get a student visa, you could be denied if you're poor, even if you have scholarship, even if you have 100% scholarship and you come from a poor village. You had a law in US immigration that can deny you for visa. You could be considered public charge because you come from a poor family background. But that has changed starting 2022, and Chris is someone who influenced that there should be fair visa practices irrespective of where you come from. So hi Chris, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Chris Richardson. I am with President and General Counsel of a company called BDV Solutions, which is an immigration consulting firm. We also have a division called ARGO, which is a company of former visa officers who've worked all over the world and who've done hundreds of thousands, actually millions of visa interviews during their time in the State Department.
Excellent. So let's first start with students who are trying for F1 visa in this year. Can you please break down how fair the immigration process is for students currently? Because in the past, as we mentioned, that it was unfair, that if you are poor, and a lot of students, even if they are able to get visa right now, last year 21 students got denied to enter the US even if they had visa, just because maybe they struggled with answering immigration questions, or maybe they were from a university which was suspicious. Can you break down how is the process fair right now?
Sure. So, just as a way of background, I'm a former visa officer. I did interviews in Nigeria, Nicaragua, Pakistan, and Spain. I was with the State Department for nearly a decade. And I don't think it's a question necessarily of what's fair or unfair. It's just what the law says. And so what the law says is, they look at every individual student. They ask us as officers, look at this student and, judge the student based on three basic criteria. I think most officers do this before the visa interview. We look at the student and we say, okay, is this student somebody who's taken serious research experiences, serious research into this university? All right. So that's the first question. Is this person actually have a good reason to go to this university? And so when I was a visa officer, I would ask, why are you going to this school? That's the first question we always ask. Why did you pick this school? Why are you going to this school? And, if you answer me, well, the trees are nice or the sky is nice, I don't find that to be a serious answer. So I'm going to deny you. So that's the first question, is why are you going to this school? Okay. The second question is how are you going to pay for this school, right? Because, it can't be just that you want to go to this school and you like this school. You actually have to show how you're going to pay for this school. And so if you're like, I have an uncle in a village who can cover my school, great. Give us the evidence of that. Show us that. Or you have a scholarship, great. Show us that scholarship. And then the final question is what are you going to do with your degree? And this trips some people up because they'll say, oh, well, I'm going to use that degree to stay in America forever, or I'm going to move to America, I'm going to become a doctor in the US, and I'm never going back to my home country. Well, the thing is that this is a non-immigrant visa, meaning you cannot use this visa to actually immigrate to the United States. And if you tell the officers that you're going to immigrate to the United States, that's a ground for denial. And so really officers are looking to answer those three questions. And so if I'm asking you, why'd you pick this school, and did you apply to other schools? If you tell me, no, I didn't apply to any other schools, I only applied to this one school, I'm going to say, well, that doesn't make any sense to me, because when I was a student, I applied to lots of different schools, right? And so really people need to think about these interviews in a way that's comfortable and confident. And that's why you have ARGO, to help explain these things, to have former visa officers who can tell you what the officer's really thinking, because that's something that a lawyer doesn't know. That's something that people on the street don't know. Really only visa officers themselves know why they approve and why they deny.
I completely agree. When I was interviewing for an F1 visa, I had only one acceptance. I got rejected by 5 universities, and 1 out of 6 visa officer was like, this could be illegitimate case, and they asked me very rigorous questions. So can you define what are the ways you define illegitimate case versus a legitimate case for F1 visa or H1B visa? Both.
The thing is that, every country's different, right? And so like the answer to that question would be very different in Nigeria versus in Spain versus in Pakistan. But in general, I think across all the embassies I worked in, when I ask you, why do you want to go to this school? What school are you going to, and why do you want to go to it? The story you told makes sense to me. It always made sense to me in whatever country I'm in. I applied to 6 different schools. I can tell you why I applied to each of those schools. And I can tell you that I only got accepted at this one, so that's the one I'm going to. That story makes sense, and that's a legitimate reason, in my mind. But if I asked you that question and you only applied to one school, and your answer is like, well, my brother-in-law from 40 years ago went to that school, right? Or I only applied to this one school, and it's a 2-year school that's like to learn English. Like I think for a lot of officers, it's like that answer just doesn't make sense. And if you are in a country like a Nigeria or a Pakistan, even when I served there, and even in India, it's true when you say that, well, I'm going to go study at like a English school. Like a lot of people will say, oh, I'm going to go study at a school to learn English in the US. And that just seems to not make sense to us because we're like, well, you can learn English in Pakistan. You can learn English in India. You can learn English in Nigeria. Why do you need to go to the US to learn English? Right. And so it has to be more than just, one school, for this one little reason. And especially if it's a rural school in the middle of nowhere, right? That raises even more suspicion among officers. So if you're like, I applied to North Dakota State University. Okay. Why'd you apply to North Dakota State? Because I love the trees there. Did you apply to any other schools? No. That doesn't make any sense because America has 50 states. You're in India or you're in Pakistan or you're in China and you found a school in North Dakota. North Dakota is the most random state. I have never even been to North Dakota. Most Americans can't even find North Dakota on a map. Most visa officers can't find North Dakota on a map, right? And so, it's one thing if you're applying to Columbia University or if you're applying to like UNC Chapel Hill or Emory or, Berkeley. If it's a really well-known school that's known universally, most officers will take that. Yes, you know what? It makes sense that, you want to go to that school and apply to that school. But if it's a school that's not really well known among Americans, they're going to want to know, well, if I've never heard of this school and I've never been to that state, how could you have been? Right? And so that's the difference between legitimate, I think, versus illegitimate is, do the answers that you're giving me make sense in the context of what an American would think? Meaning, as an American citizen, an American, is your answer making sense to me? If your answer is not making sense to me as an American, I'm probably not going to give you the visa.
I think in the principles of America, I think they need to follow that America appreciates merit. And if you put merit in every context, that I deserved it, I was one of the best students, able to compete with Americans applying to this university, I was able to, from India, represent at the same level Americans were able to represent that university. That shows that, you are eligible to sit next to Americans. Is that what you will say?
No. And I think that this is something so I think a lot of, unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of people think that because you're applying to a school in America or that coming to America is some kind of right, American visa officers would tell you that coming to America isn't a right. It's a privilege. It's an extraordinary privilege. And because it's a privilege, the law, the U.S. immigration law give officers a lot of power, right? And so if I, as a visa officer, if you're like, look at my paperwork, I have all this paperwork, and I'm like, I don't look at your paperwork, denied. You know, you're like, well, how can you do that to me? It's because I have a right to, because the law gives me that right to be that way. Fortunately, or unfortunately, right? But that's just the way the law is written. Immigration law is written in a way that it gives officers a lot of discretionary power, right? And so even if you are a student from India and you could be the best and the brightest, and I've seen it where they're the best and brightest students, probably far superior in a lot of ways to our own American students, but these American universities are built by American taxpayers. These American universities are built and funded by the American people. And the American people at the end of the day are our customers and our clients, right? And so, yes, you know, as a student from India or a student from some other country, you've paid money and you're willing to pay money for that privilege of going to one of our universities and for that ability to interview. But as officers, we see it as, you know, we don't have an obligation to give you this visa. And in fact, the law, immigration law is, this is how immigration law is written. Immigration law is written to tell me as the visa officer, when you come to my window, you're guilty, as in I'm going to deny you until you can prove to me otherwise. So that is the basis. That is the front. The minute you come to my interview window, I have an obligation to deny you, and your obligation is to prove to me that you should not be denied. And so that's the burden is on you, the visa applicant, is not on the officer, to prove that you deserve this right. Now that there's a whole lot of messed up stuff with that, but that's the way the law is written.
I'm asking you this question because recently affirmative action in 2023 got revoked. It was from Asian American students who said that it's really difficult to get into Harvard and MIT. And now a lot of Indians think it's easier for them, even Indian Americans, international students, they think it's easier for them to make it to MIT and Harvard post that, because we saw that percentage of Asian Americans increased by 5% in America and percentage of international student increased by 10% as well. So, I think people see that America works on merit, and people really appreciates that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. America for sure. We for sure do work on merit, but at the end of the day, if you're a student abroad, the visa, like, well, listen, if you're applying to Berkeley or Harvard or Yale and you get into one of those schools, of course, like the officer is going to give you that visa, right? Because clearly you're a serious student, right? But if you're applying to North Dakota State or Wyoming Tech or like some small school, that becomes more of a challenge, because officers don't look at those and think, well, that's something that I necessarily want to issue without knowing, you know, why you applied to that school in the first place.
Totally. Now, can you share your stance on affirmative action? Do you think it is bringing merit, if you feel comfortable, or is it like promoting America works on merit, or it is trying to kind of create unfair opportunity for the people who have the ability to train themselves for SAT or get that merit, and kind of punishing
Yeah.
the marginalized groups?
Listen, I think that the key to understanding America is that, okay, so the people who benefit from affirmative action are, to the extent that they do benefit, because there's such a small number, it's really minuscule number. The people who really benefit from any type of affirmative action are legacy students whose parents went to Harvard, people whose parents went to Yale. Those people, like 40% of their makeup are those students, right? And so I think personally the argument over affirmative action is somewhat silly, because it's pitting one group of dispossessed people against another group of dispossessed people, and not focused on the fact that legacy students make up more than all of us combined, right? And so it doesn't matter if you're like a black student or Indian student or whatever, your ability to get into the university, whether it's that minuscule number, that isn't the issue. The issue is that the way they select people in general across universities is very suspect, right? And so when you say that America's a meritocracy, yes, America's a meritocracy to some extent, right? But if my parents went to Yale, or my parents went to Columbia, or my parents went to any university, right, my chances of getting into that university are superior to any Asian student or black student or woman or whatever, because that strength of that, because, and but those universities would say, well, those legacy students, their parents are more likely to give money to keep the school going, right? So it doesn't matter if you were a good student or a bad student. A lot of these legacy students are not particularly good students, but their parents gave a lot of money to the school, right? Schools don't run on like meritocracy and charm and love and joy. They run on money, right? And so like, if I'm a university, I can totally see why I would invest all of my eggs and resources into letting in legacy students, and then I would let these marginalized people over here fight over 2 seats, right? And so you have a group of marginalized students fighting against a group of another marginalized students for like 2 seats.
And now the biggest question I want to ask you is, can you explain how immigration process has been evolving from Obama era to Trump to Biden? And then we will talk about the future.
So, so under, really before President Trump, immigration, especially when it came to visa officers and especially the embassies themselves, was very actually bipartisan. There wasn't a lot, there was some politics in it, but the Republican Party and Democratic Party were both mostly led by people who were marginally supportive of immigration and really did want to see, like you could see 70 U.S. senators pass an immigration bill in 2007, 2006, right? You could see that. The House wouldn't probably put it before but whereas President Trump really politicized immigration in a really strong and harsh way, in a different way, that it made immigration very polarized, where a lot of Americans rightfully or wrongfully blame immigrants for a lot of the problems that happen in America. And I think, though, that then President Biden came in and I don't think really particularly cared about immigration. I don't think no one gets elected wants to deal with issues they don't care about. Joe Biden has never really shown interest in immigration. He's never really liked immigration. And so he left it to a lot of his staff members to kind of manage it. And I don't think that they were ready for the volume and deluge of people who were coming over the border in such large numbers. I think they let a lot of these people in, not realizing that, these people were going to abuse the system as it is. And I don't think necessarily the asylum law wasn't written for 90% of the people filing for asylum. The humanitarian parole program probably wasn't written for most of these humanitarian parole people coming in over the border. And unfortunately, we've created a system now, because we don't fix legal immigration and we don't allow more legal immigrants to come over, quote unquote legal immigrants to come over, that people are basically using any tool at their disposal, like asylum, like humanitarian parole, things that really aren't meant for what they're being used for. And unfortunately, it's punishing people from other parts of the world. Now, if you want to talk about a meritocracy, that's an example of a lack of meritocracy for our country, right? Where, any country that was serious about meritocracy and serious about helping people would want to attract the best and brightest, would want to bring over the best and brightest. Absolutely, right? And yet our system says, well, if you come across the border and you make it across the border and you find a border agent and say, hey, I'm claiming asylum, you get to stay, get a work permit, welcome to America. See you maybe in 10 years for your visa, for your asylum interview, right? Whereas if you are a student in India or a student in China or a student in Nigeria, and you are bright and intelligent, you have to go through some horrible visa officer like me first. Maybe then you'll get to America to study for 4 years. And then what happens after that 4 years? Like maybe you get to stay in America. Maybe you can find a role. Maybe you get an H-1B. And even if you get an H-1B, we have this system now where we don't welcome these people, right? And so to me, our immigration system is almost symbolic of the problem of the United States, in that you have people who want to come here and want to do it the right way, but we have prioritized and given power and voice to the people who want to cut corners and do it, I wouldn't say the wrong way, but certainly not the way the law was intended.
That sheds a lot of light on, the reality of meritocracy in America. Now, what about the future? Since you have influenced politics and, our world leaders a lot, so how do you see the future of merit-based immigration in the next 4 years, depending on who gets elected?
If Kamala Harris wins, I doubt there will be any improvements on the immigration system from what's today. I don't think Republicans have much of an incentive to work with her. I think that she would need to really, really, really. I just don't imagine Republicans, especially with President Trump out there, wanting to work with her on any kind of immigration reform. And quite frankly, because the border situation has calmed down so much, there's no incentive, right? And so, like, back when the border was wild and crazy, I can see Congress maybe passing it for her, but I doubt that's going to happen. Under President Trump, I would assume it's just going to it would be harder. He had 4 years, right? Everyone's always like, oh, when he comes back, he's going to do all this stuff. No, whatever he did when he was president is what he's going to do when he is president again, except a little bit harder than what it was before, right? And so if you think President Trump is going to do a merit-based immigration system, if he didn't do it in 2016 to 2020, he's really not going to do it now. And he has no incentive to do it now. Well, he'll have even less incentive to do it now because he only has one term left, right? And so I unfortunately don't think that, it doesn't matter who wins the presidential election. For those thinking that there's going to be broad strokes or broad changes to the immigration system, it's just not going to happen. I don't think either presidential candidate has the incentive, desire, or willingness to do that. And if you think that, well, that's not logical and that doesn't make any sense, and of course America needs, more legal immigrants and they need this stuff, of course we do. But our leaders don't have to follow logic or reason, because if they did, they wouldn't be elected, right? So it's easy to demonize these immigrants. It's easy to demonize people. It's easier to do that than actually come together with easy, practical solutions to fixing our immigration system. And neither political party is willing to do that because it's not in their incentive. It's not in their I wouldn't say it's certainly in the best interest of the country, but politically there's no benefit to fighting for people who can't vote. And that's what you have to remember, right? People wonder, well, why don't we go out and do this stuff for immigrants? Do immigrants vote? No. So why would the law, they're not going to write law to benefit people who don't vote for them. Who do they write the laws to benefit? They write the laws to benefit Social Security recipients, Medicare recipients, people who need child tax credits. You know why they write laws around those people? Because those people actually can vote, and they can vote them out of office. Immigrants can be demonized and immigrants can be hated. What is the natural constituency for immigrants in America? Who supports immigrants and immigration in America, right? And I think that's what immigrants have to ask themselves, and they really need to think about is, of course it's in the best interest of our country to have more immigration, but what specific group of Americans who actually vote does that benefit? And because there is no group of Americans who that specifically benefits, I really don't foresee any kind of immigration law being passed anytime soon.
The chances of this process improving are barely minimum.
Yeah.
So that's what we have to realize. It's going to remain the same.
It's going to remain the same. And if one of the candidates wins, you should expect it to get a little bit worse. You should expect more. It's odd. I think that if you are waiting in line with the visa bulletin, it might actually shorten a little bit under Trump, because he's going to make it so hard for people to apply and do so many denials that you'll have less applicants, and therefore maybe the visa bulletin will actually shrink a little bit. If for those who follow the visa bulletin, it's gotten significantly worse under Biden, and that's because they're giving everyone I-140s and everyone DOL, everyone's able to apply now. And so the backlogs are exploding again. Whereas under Trump, the backlogs were actually shrinking because he was a lot harder on people being able to enter the process to begin with, right? And so I think if you are a person who on H-1B waiting for EB-1, EB-2, or EB-3, it might actually be a little bit easier under Trump because less people are going to apply. That's a true meritocracy there. right? Because Trump is going to deny a bunch of people. His USCIS and DHS are going to probably deny like 30-40% of people. I hope you're not one of them, right? So that's the thing. It's like, well, if you are a truly meritorious applicant, a great applicant, got a great job, and you can get through what that is, then you'll do well. But if your case is on the cusp under Biden, it's pretty much denied under Trump. And so, I think under Trump, it'll be a little bit harder. But for those who are truly, truly meritorious, it might actually be a little bit better.
I think I totally agree with you. That's what happened in his term as well. When COVID happened, green card processes were paused. But
Yeah.
he promises completely different. He says if you graduate, study in the US, you will immediately get green card. So I think, this is politics is a dirty game. That's what you would say here?
No, no, listen. Trump said that same. So Trump did say that yes, anyone who's a student gets a green card. He said those same exact words in 2016, right? He said the same exact thing back when he ran last time in 2015, 2016. He said he promised anybody who graduates from a university is going to get a green card. Fast forward 8 years later, he's saying the same exact thing. He was president for 4 years. He had that opportunity to do it then, and he didn't do it because there's no benefit for him to do that, right? And so all these and I hear this all the time from students. Students will come up to me and they'll say, "Well, President Trump promised me that I'm going to get a green card," and I'm just like, you know what? He's made a lot of promises. He's made a lot of promises to a lot of different people, and 9 times out of 10, he doesn't keep those promises. So if you are one of those people that's supporting him and assuming that he's going to fulfill that promise, the only thing I would tell you is he promised the same exact thing back in 2016 and nothing happened with it. And incidentally, President Biden promised the same thing in 2020 and nothing happened with it. If you think that these presidents have any incentive to help people who do not vote, at the end of the day, immigrants don't vote. You don't have a voice. You don't have a voice in our system. Our system is made for Americans, the people who vote. And so if the American people are like, we don't care about this, / we are hostile to immigration and immigrants, our politics and our politicians are going to follow that line, right? And so let's say that you are a President Trump and you're like, okay, you know what? I'm going to try to get this passed. Who does this make happy? Who does this benefit for President Trump? And I mean that seriously. Who would be happy about this? Some Wall Street tech people? Some Facebook run? He hates those people. So why would he do anything to help those people at all at the end of the day, right? And so if he does this and proposes it, he's going to anger his base of people who instinctually hate immigrants, and there's no benefit to it. So he's saying that now to raise money from Elon Musk and all these Facebook people, but the minute he gets elected, he's not going to do that stuff. And that's the same exact thing he did back in 2016. And the Democrats do the same thing. They always promise this stuff, but they're never going to give it to you because there's no incentive to do that. Politically, there's no incentive.
I think international students need to understand that no matter what policies politicians are trying to impose, at the end of the day, they go through because of lobbying groups and American people. If they don't want a policy, they're going to deny it. These are not imposed by immigrants. Wonderful answer. Now, most important thing I want to ask you about is 45% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrant families or their children. And entrepreneurial visa is the most popular visa that people based on merit want to get in America. So what are the ways people can do it? There is something called, as I heard, that you can file H-1B for your own company you create in the US. Can you elaborate on these ways to become an entrepreneur in the US?
Yeah, there are several ways that I think the Biden administration has really honed in on what's called the EB-2 NIW. That's been something that's been incredibly popular. You don't have to go through the Department of Labor process with that. There are types of O visas. There are some J1 called postdoc visas that entrepreneurial. And I think there is actually a new visa that's just an entrepreneurial visa that's out there too. And so That's one of those ways. You can open an office. If you have an office in one country, you can open it up in the United States with an L1 new office visa. That's always a possibility. If you're from an E2 country, that would be great too, because you can always just invest $75,000 to $100,000 in the U.S., probably a little bit more than that, to open a business in America too, if you're from an E2 country. And so there's always a myriad of ways to do this. Although I tell people, if you're like an entrepreneur and you're single, the best way to get to America is just marry an American. Just find an American and get married. That's the fastest and easiest path to getting a green card and being an American citizen. Everything else is hard.
So, can you break down on E2 countries? What are the E2 countries? How they?
So I think most of the European countries, Japan, some of the South American countries too. But basically, it's a treaty trader visa. So the United States has special visa treaties with certain countries, Canada, Mexico, most European countries, Australia. And basically what happens is that those people, it's an investor visa. And what those people can do, India, unfortunately, is not one of them. Maybe one day it will be. But basically what those people can do is they can invest in the United States. They can bring over, $100,000, $200,000 of investment and open a business in the United States.
I think so. Based on what you said, I think for an international student, a great path could be during their OPT, the first year of OPT, when they're allowed to do pretty much most of the things they want to. They can create their company and start working on it, and by the next year, be ready and make the company or the entrepreneurial venture be at a point that it is able to file for an H-1B for them.
Yeah.
So that is the most popular route, right?
Yeah, that's an incredibly popular route for a lot of international students who want to remain in the U.S. Although, I think under if there is a Trump administration, I'd be very, very leery of that, because I think that that's one of those areas where USIS probably won't be as amenable and open to doing that anymore, because generally you want to have a system where people find an employer and get sponsored for that. Although it's very difficult to find employers willing to do that, unfortunately, right now.
Having a journey, immigration journey in the US, I want to add on how tough it is. If you go above the speed limit in Texas or Virginia or in many states, it can be classified as class 1 demeanor. In Texas, it's a felony that can immediately hamper your immigration status in the US, and you can be classified as criminal. So can you break down how can students, if they get into, let's say, a speeding ticket that way, which is classified felony or class 1 demeanor, have like mental support to have a status in the US?
So in 90% of well, listen, I think even in Texas, that law is only if it's like you cause bodily injury, death, etc., etc. I don't think that it's like you'd have to be in most places. Like speeding is like a misdemeanor. And so unless you hit somebody, unless you're like driving recklessly, and then it becomes a felony, then it becomes a different issue, right? And so speeding tickets universally are a misdemeanor, and therefore that wouldn't be qualified as what's called a CIMT, which is a crime against moral turpitude. And so if you're a visa holder or if you're applying for a visa, but you have a quote unquote criminal record, anything that would lead to more than 2 years imprisonment would be called a CIMT, which would bar you from coming to the US unless you got a waiver for it, right? And so the first step is whatever you do, go talk to a lawyer. Let's say if you were speeding, you want to go talk to a lawyer, make sure that it's actually a misdemeanor, something that's less than 2 years. Because if it's something that's more, or even try to plead it down, although that gets kind of tricky with immigration law. Obviously now if you're drunk driving, that's a different story, because that can be and will be a felony, and that will get you barred from coming to the U.S. or being able to remain in the U.S. And the State Department is very, very strict with students and and drunk driving. They will revoke your visa. It's very rare that they revoke your visa while you're in the United States, but that is one reason they will revoke your visa. Your records get sent straight to the State Department, and they have a whole unit at the State Department that just revokes visas for people who did drunk driving.
I think very well said. I think the biggest decision when you get into that spot is don't pay the fine. Don't accept that you are at fault. You are the
Oh
victim.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do not
Fight
accept
it.
any kind of fault.
Yeah.
You better fight it, and you better get a lawyer. Because a lot of people, especially people who are here on student visas, right? They'll think, oh, I'll just plead guilty. And you definitely don't want to plead guilty to anything. Because you think you're doing, and even if you have a criminal lawyer, make sure your criminal lawyer understands the implications of immigration law, right? Because your criminal lawyer might tell you something, but they're thinking about it from the mind of a criminal lawyer, which is like, we want to just get this out of the way. And so in criminal law, it's very, very reasonable for criminal defense attorneys to advise their clients, just plead guilty. What's the big deal? Not realizing that in immigration law, you pleading guilty is an admission of this crime. You now have this thing on your record where it doesn't necessarily have to be a felony. It can be something that could have led to 2 years in jail as well. And so you've now pled guilty to that, and now you have a crime against moral turpitude and you're barred. And I've seen that happen a lot, where people listen to their criminal defense attorney, not realizing that they probably needed to talk to an immigration attorney as well.
Yeah, that's the biggest reason. Like, students get scared to drive. Students get scared to commit a crime. They don't want to do it. And that's also part of the reason in especially in the US, immigrants commit the least amount of crimes who are educated, come from,
Yeah.
come on the basis of merit. And that has to change. Before getting into Argo, how it is different from other attorneys and companies that help in visa, can you break down what are the biggest misconceptions students or applicants for US visa have when they are whether filing for green card or visa?
So the biggest misconception amongst people who are applying for student visas is that the officers have to look at your documents. So many visa applicants put so much emphasis and weight on the documents, not realizing that officers don't have to look at any of your documents. And officers don't have time to look at any of your documents. It really does come down to the interview. It comes down to how you present yourself, and it comes down to how you answer their questions. Think about it this way. When I was a visa officer, I would have to interview 100, 120 people a day. 100, 120 people a day. And I don't have time to sit there and read like through all of these documents, right? And so what I really had to focus on is how does this person present themselves at the window? And that's what makes Argo so valuable for visa applicants, is because we help you prepare for that visa interview to put your best foot forward. Now, if you are a student who's applied to one of these random schools and your story isn't a story that is going to be issued, we as visa officers, former visa officers, will tell you, hey, chances are you're going to be denied. And we're very honest with that stuff. But if you are an applicant who just needs a little bit of help in understanding where you need to focus your questions on, that's where we help. We really help people understand what that visa process is like and what's going to happen in that visa process. And so the biggest misconception is that paper matters. No amount of documents you take into the interview really matter. It really does come down to the interview.
So true. And what about green card? What is the biggest misconception people have? What I've heard honestly is like, people don't realize that with just their experience as an engineer, they can still, find the ways of O1, find the ways of EB1A, file their own green card. What do you think?
I think that is a misconception. I think the biggest one is that there's some kind of trick or easy way around this, or if there's some kind of way like you can cut corners with it, right? The visa bulletin is the visa bulletin. It is cruel, it is exacting, it is terrible, and there's no shortcuts to it, right? And so like I think that a lot of people, when they call immigration attorneys, they think this immigration attorney is going to find them some secret sauce. Immigration law is very discretionary. It's really complex, and it's really hard. And so if anybody in the immigration space makes you guarantees or tells you, oh, I'm going to promise you X, Y, or Z, 100% going to happen, there's no way. Immigration law is way, way too complex for that. And so I think that looking for shortcuts in immigration is something that people think, they can do. But unfortunately, there are no shortcuts. You just have to wait in line like everybody else, unless you marry an American. And that's a whole different story. But there are, but secondly, you're right. There are there's 185 visa categories. People don't realize that there are 185 visa categories. The only one anyone ever talks about is H1B or F1. But if you want to study and work in the U.S., there are H2B visas, there are J visas. There are some types of J visas that are very similar to H1B, and if anything, even better than H1B. There are types of visas that are H1B cap exempt. H1B is capped at 65,000. But guess what? If you teach, if you want to be an educator in the space, you can get H1B cap exempt. And so there's O visas, there's EB2 NIW where you can sponsor yourself. There's EB1 opportunities out there as well. There's so many different types of visas that I think people don't think about because lawyers, immigration lawyers, and I'm one of them, they only know about H1B. They only know about E2 regular and EB1. And those are the things that they know. But they don't know about all this other plethora of options that are out there and that people should probably think about and consider.
As an ex-visa officer or consulate, can you share the most painful visa rejection story that you had to give to a student or to an applicant?
There's always, every officer has like really, really sad stories. The saddest stories are always the ones where people are seeking medical treatment in the U.S. Whether I remember I had a visa applicant who wanted cancer treatment at a hospital and she couldn't afford it. She had no money for it. She had no ability she just wanted to go to this hospital. And it's like, no, I can't issue. By law, I cannot issue that visa. Right. And so, when you deny those visas, you are giving that person a death sentence in a way, because, if you're in a country like Nigeria, where it just doesn't have very good medical options, it's very, very real. And so as visa officers, you really, really have to make those hard, sad decisions. Every visa officer has one of those cases where they denied someone who needed medical treatment. But I think that's an important thing to understand, because when students complain to us about, man, that officer was so horrible, how could you deny my story of going to school? The reality is that it's very easy for a visa officer to not deny someone going to school after having denied someone who wanted medical treatment, right? Like once you've made those really hard decisions and hard calls, everything else is unfortunately and sadly pretty easy to deny. And so, I think the worst one I've ever had was a student who was applying for Harvard. It was a student in Nigeria applying for Harvard. And again, like I remember I said in the beginning, you have 3 questions I'm asking you. Why'd you apply to this school? How can you afford this school? And what are you doing with your degree? And so I asked the student, what are you going to do after you graduate from Harvard? He's like, oh, I'm going to be a doctor in America and stay in America. And I said, okay, I'm going to ask this again. Knowing that the law says I cannot issue you a visa if you're telling me you're staying in America. So I'm going to just ask you one more time. What are you going to do in America? What are you going to do after you graduate? And he said to me again, I told you, I'm going to stay in America. I'm never coming back to Nigeria ever again. And I was like, man, I'm going to ask you a 3rd time. Because you're going to Harvard. You got this big old degree on, I assume, some kind of knowledge and smarts. You wouldn't be going to Harvard if you didn't have some kind of knowledge or smarts. So I'm going to ask you again for the 3rd time. What are you going to do with this degree after you graduate? And he said, I've already told you, sir. I am never coming back to Nigeria. I'm going to form my life in America. I'm going to find a nice American girl, and I'm never coming back. And I had to deny that. I denied him his visa.
What is the incentive visa officers get when they're issuing a visa? How are they trained? How do they make sure that a student on a fair basis is denied or given a visa?
Well, one, it is incredibly hard to become a visa officer. I know it doesn't seem that way, but it is an incredibly difficult process, right? So only about 2% 2 to 5% of people who apply for the process actually get to the process of being, because visa officers are diplomats. They're U.S. diplomats. And so to become a U.S. diplomat is an incredibly hard process, right? So you have to go through 3 different types of tests. You have like this really hard written test. Once you get to that, you have an oral exam that's all day in front of like former U.S. diplomats. You have to get medical clearance, security clearance, so they interview everybody who ever had anything to do with you under the sun. And then you get put on a list that's like hundreds long, right? And they only probably pick the top 20 from that list. So there might be a list of 200 people, and then they'll pick the top 20, and that's it. So it's an incredibly hard process to get through. So if you are the type of person who's gotten through that process, you're probably already fairly smart, you're probably already fairly honor bound, and you're already probably very understanding of the significance in the role. Now, obviously, that's not true for all visa officers. You have a lot of them who are just terrible. But the vast majority of them are really smart, competent people, right? So that's the first thing. You have really good people. The second thing is you have the law, which is very clear. The law isn't about fairness. The law doesn't care about fairness, right? So in a fair system, that Harvard student, when I interviewed them, I should have given them that person the visa. But that's not what the law says. The law says, this person is an intending immigrant until they show to you that they are not. They are a person who is intending to stay in America until they show you that they are not intending to stay in America. And what are the things that they're going to show you that they are planning on coming back to their home country? Do they have a spouse in their home country? Do they have kids in their home country? Do they have jobs in their home country? Have they traveled internationally to other countries before? Those are the things that tell us as visa officers that you are likely to remain in your home country or come back from your home country. If you are young, if you are single, if you've never traveled before, those are all indications that you have no plans on returning to your home country. And so it's not about, is it fair or unfair? It's about, what does the law say? And the law tells me this person is guilty until they show you otherwise, no matter who they are. In a sense, it is very fair, because it doesn't matter how rich or poor you are. Everybody starts off being guilty until you prove yourself to be innocent. Innocent meaning you're going to come back to your home country after your visa interview, after you get the visa and visit America.
What will be your message to future visa officers if they had to restart their journey?
Visa officers?
Yeah.
My message to them would be that it's a very hard job. It's an incredibly hard job. We have to make a lot of hard decisions. But don't be afraid to make those decisions, and don't be fearful of making those decisions. Somebody's got to make those calls. Someone's got to make those decisions, and that has to be you. And that's a really hard thing to do. But don't take it to heart and don't take it personally. I think a lot of visa officers struggle with depression and alcoholism because they take a lot of that stuff to heart. And it's really hard. Like, you have a lot of people that you think should get visas, and you're telling them they can't get visas, and you get enough of that, and it wears down on you. So I would tell any future visa officer not to take that stuff to heart, and do the best you can, but don't beat yourself up over it.
So what will be your message to founders who want to make their way in the US?
Be patient, think broadly, think broad-based, talk to a visa officer or former, like an attorney, but don't talk about just H-1B. Talk about J-1. Are there J-1 options out there? Are there postdoc options out there? What are the full plethora of my options that are out there? I think that is more important. And that's what I would tell anybody who's an entrepreneur, is just don't assume that there's just 1 or 2 different types of visas that benefit you. Make sure that anybody you talk to is telling you about all the different types of visa options that are out there.
What interview do you think is the hardest one to pass?
The student visa is incredibly difficult actually to pass. And I also think the student visa is pretty hard. The B1, B2 can be very hard too, unless you have a good reason to go to America. I think B1, B2 can be pretty tough to pass as well. So the F1s and the B1s are statistically the ones that get denied the most, especially if you're from certain countries too. So
Yeah. Now, what's your story? What made you found Argo Visa, and how is it unique than
yeah, sure.
other immigration attorneys?
After I left the State Department, I really wanted to find a way to help visa applicants. I thought that so many visa applicants, when I was a visa officer, I noticed that so many of them would come for visa interviews. They would talk to all these people from the street, or touts or whatever they're called, off the street. And these people would give like terrible advice, like, oh, show the officer paperwork, show the officer this. This was the secret to getting a visa. And all this advice was just awful. And I wanted to be a voice of reason, of difference. I wanted to educate visa applicants on what's the real story behind the window. What are these officers really thinking when they deny a visa? And that's something that no immigration attorney knows. And so Argo is the largest company of former visa officers in the world. And we really pride ourselves on educating visa applicants and helping visa applicants navigate the system. We are not coaches. We're not touts. We don't promise you secrets. What we're telling you is the truth. We're telling you the things that officers can't tell you, right? So when people get denied their visa, the officer just gives them a sheet of paper, 214B paper, and says, well, that's it. You can't ask them why. You can't ask them, well, what's going on behind that window as to why you're denying them. And that's what Argo is. Argo is an explanatory of what happens behind that window, why these people are making their decisions, so that visa applicants can be informed. And that's the primary reason why I founded the company, is I wanted people to be educated, and I wanted to help immigrants understand and know this system in a way that they weren't learning from anybody else out there.
Excellent. And how can students make use of Argo Visa to its best potential, whether it's immigrants in the US or students trying to get F1 visa, or someone wants to file for green card?
I think the first thing is you're honest with yourself. I think that a lot of people come to Argo or come to any company or any lawyer thinking that they're going to fix their thing. But if you are not qualified, then if the visa officers, and if I, as a former consular officer, if I'm telling you why you're probably not going to pass the interview and why you're not qualified, listen to me. Really, really listen to what I'm trying to tell you, because I'm probably telling you the truth about it, right? So I've had people who've applied 5, 6, 7 times, and you can still get visas after 5, 6, 7 times. But you just have to be honest with yourself. And so the best way to use Argo is to listen and ask thoughtful questions and ask yourself, can I really actually get this visa? And if you can't, then you have to be honest with yourself and the officer as to why.
Excellent. And I wish all the candidates best of luck. They can check out Argo Visa in the description below. And thank you so much, Chris, for your time. It educates a lot about election, about policies, how government works to bring the best immigration policies in the nation. And it was very educative talk. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. You have a good day, okay?
You too. Thank you.